Stainmore, northern England. A land of open skies, desolate hills, ruins of the old world. It's had many names over the years, many people. In the mid-10th century, the winds of political change in Northumbria at his back, the last Norse ruler of Jorvik, Eric Bloodaxe, made a last-ditch effort to cross this moor, accompanied by his chosen men and armed retainers, seeking to reach his allies on the Irish Sea, to live to fight another day. He'd never make it, betrayed and killed en route. A solitary monument left here on a roadside still marks the passing of that last great Viking ruler in Britain. The road he likely took, bits of it still well paved at the time, at least in part had been in use for close to 1,000 years. A great highway built by the old empire which once ruled in these parts. Vast construction projects to link up their glittering cities and walled strongholds. Used, reused and marvelled at for centuries to come by people with little knowledge of building in stone. Today, as in many places in Britain, the modern motorway still cuts a swathe along that old path. For after the Romans abandoned Britain at the start of the 5th century, their continental heartlands collapsing around them, many of their highways continued in use, and many rulers would continue to hark back to that imperial majesty of days gone by. But in truth, it would be hundreds of years before any sort of comparable architecture would be attempted again. Much longer for an empire of comparable power to arise. Though bardic tradition often spins a different, more heroic yarn, and the tiny handful of written sources from the era add further trimming to the tale, archaeology tells us that 5th, 6th and 7th century Britain was a post-apocalyptic landscape. Where once armies of tens of thousands had marched along well-paved roads to war, now bands of 100 or less decided the fates of entire kingdoms. And to call them kingdoms even, as we know the term, is often a stretch. Polities at this time often amounting to little more than a river valley, a handful of followers eking out an existence in the ruins of an old Roman town. But this isn't always the case. There are hints of much larger identities too, particularly in the north and the west, where the Roman way of life never really took hold. Much older traditions clinging on. And in those years, this moor was no man's land, a frontier zone not just between rival states, but rival ways of life, opposing incompatible cultures. To the east, pagan Germanic settlers, descendants of imperial mercenaries, migrating boat people, and opportunistic Romano-Britons alike. In archaeology, these pre-coinage, illiterate newcomers can be seen in tiny riverbound settlements, cattle corrals, burial mounds, elaborate metalwork, and over time, by the year 600 or so, princely burials, complete with majestic grave goods. The sign of the birth of kingship, power, and ever larger political organizations. To the west of the moor, sheltered by the steep hills of Cumbria, enclosed by the windswept Irish Sea, sits the green fertile valley of the River Eden. Once home to a kingdom truly worthy of that title, a last holdout of the old world. This wasn't Anglo-Saxon, and it wasn't really Roman either, but British. The massive land wall built by the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD across the entirety of northern Britain is perhaps the most visible remnant of the Roman world left here today. But a city on its western edge lingers on too. Once home to a city council able to dictate its own affairs, today we know the place as Carlisle. And there's a good argument for this being the last city in Roman Britain. For people continued to live here long after the Western Empire collapsed. Not only that, but several fortresses along the wall show signs of continued occupation too. At Housesteads, Vindolanda and Burd Oswald, to name a few. But did these people see themselves as Romans? Maybe, but just as likely is their re-embracing of their own pre-Roman Brythonic culture. Further south from Carlisle, Brythonic place names like Penrith still hark back to that time. Celtic holdouts turning to old customs for survival. For the kingdom in question, which once ruled in these parts, and perhaps stretching north into Galloway to the north, the Pennines to the south, is a British name too, sung in songs for hundreds of years, all the way down to today. We know it as Regeth, forged in the fires and chaos of the 5th century. Their ancestors had been here long before the Romans had come. Their descendants would long outlive the empire. Little remains of that ancient kingdom now. A scattering of hill forts, a handful of inscriptions and place names. The Britons leave scant little trace in the archaeological record. But, according to many scholars, this was one of the most important of those British polities to emerge in the aftermath of Rome. Arguably the most important of the Hen Ogledd, the Old North, just one of a plethora of rival kingdoms that arose in the wake of the Roman withdrawal. At some, like Gododin in modern-day Lothian, we see older tribal identities re-emerging. At others, like Old Clute and perhaps Regeth, they are entirely new. Renegotiations of old tribal identities, faced with the uncertainty of a new world. Today, the Hen Ogledd is largely forgotten in England. For the most part, no museums or monuments can be found on the landscape. And yet, the Old North lives on in a rich corpus of stories spanning 1500 years, passed on one generation to the next. Tales like that of Urien, Regeth's most famous king, praised in bardic tradition as a smiter of the Anglians in many battles, champion of Britain, and part inspiration for the Arthur legend. Though his is just one example of a vast array of stories that miraculously survive to the present, some of the oldest in all of Europe. For though the years 400 to 600 are some of the least documented in British history, in Wales, more information can be found than the previous or next 2 centuries. For them, it's the age of heroes. When the Gallo-Roman historian Gregory of Tours wrote his lauded History of the Franks in the latter 6th century, an ambitious attempt to record the history of the Germanic barbarians who now held sway in what was once Gaul. He describes a class of Gallo-Roman bishops and aristocrats still holding positions of high influence, lands, titles, and political power within the Frankish administration, still living in many of the Roman cities and continuing to use their institutions. When the Venerable Bede wrote his history in the 8th century, the first real attempt at an objective telling of events for centuries, there is no trace of anything of the sort. Just battles and bloodshed and violence between 2 diametrically opposed peoples. The situation in Britain seems to have been particularly warlike and resentful. Bitter enmity felt by people speaking different languages and of a different custom. Eventually, the Gallo-Romans would influence the already Christian Franks so much they would stop using their own language, integrating into the population, for French is a Romance language. In Britain, it would be different. In the Anglo-Saxon areas, their pagan ways of life and language would dominate. But in the West, where ancestry from the Old North would become a badge of honour for later Welsh dynasties, forming an overarching backdrop to the struggle between Saxon and Briton, the British language, Brythonic, well on the way to becoming Welsh, would become the primary language, replacing the Latin and Irish that had made inroads too. In centuries to come, Britons and English would define themselves against each other, and would continue to do so into modern times. And in the mid-6th century, amidst all the bloodshed and the warfare, something else happened too. Famine, drought, snow in midsummer. And in 536, in the far-off Eastern Roman Empire, still surviving half of the imperial majesty that was Rome, still linked to Britain by disparate trade seen in the archaeological record at places like Tintagel in Cornwall, the historian Procopius talks of the sun going dim for months on end. It's a strange tale in an otherwise completely rational and reliable account by this well-respected court historian, part of the Emperor Justinian's inner circle. And yet today, modern science corroborates the account. Tree ring evidence suggesting a significant decline in vegetation all over Eurasia from around 535 all the way until 555. We don't know exactly what caused it, but volcanic eruption might be the culprit. Ash entering the atmosphere, blocking the sun, causing temperatures to drop, crops to fail, and people to die. A literal dark age. And then we have the plague. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster record the deaths of at least 7 important rulers to disease. In Britain, it's much the same. All over Europe in the mid-6th century, it's thought as much as half of the population met miserable ends to the very first outbreak of bubonic plague. At the city of Viriconium, an unusually well-preserved post-Roman settlement, a complete collapse of the population took place. The city limits shrinking from 79 to 10 hectares. New wooden structures now overlaying the previous stone foundations. The people here having little connection to those once mighty colonnades and still visible imperial remnants. The intense bleakness of this era, beset as it was by plague, famine, and war, may well have left such a mark on the psyche of Britain that it was later remembered as the concept of the wasteland in medieval literature. It is in this post-apocalyptic landscape, unimaginably terrible conditions, that the mostly unrecorded struggle between Briton and Saxon was waged. This is the untold tale of those forlorn kingdoms. War leaders without armies, kings without kingdoms. A tale pieced together bit by bit from the depths of time. One of the most incredible ever told. This is the entire history of the Old North. An epic tale spanning some 300 years, from the end of Roman Britain to the early Middle Ages. So get yourself comfortable, there's a lot to take in. From Constantinople to Scotland, I travelled all over Europe to film it. It's well over 3 hours long, and it took me 3 years to make. But first, a quick word from the sponsor of this video. A long-time supporter of the channel, and one of my favourite streaming services on the web. It's Magellan TV. For just a small monthly fee, you can find thousands of documentaries on practically any subject you can think of. History, geography, science, culture, and much, much more. All streamed directly to your phone, your tablet, and your smart TV. My current recommendation is Justinian, last of the Romans, and we'll be seeing much more of him later. But you can also find loads more on Rome, ancient history, and medieval Britain. All of the good stuff. Now I've teamed up with Magellan to offer you an exclusive free trial. Head on over to try.magellantv.com/historytime or click on my link in the description below. Now, back to antiquity. By the mid-530s, a well-informed citizen of the Eastern Mediterranean may well have assumed that a Roman revival was on the way. The restoration of the entire Western Empire. For the Eastern Empire hadn't just survived the 5th century calamities that beset its Western counterpart. Safe behind the massive Theodosian walls, greatest in the world, built in the 440s to keep out the Huns. For decades now, it had thrived. Still firmly holding on to all of its immensely rich eastern possessions, including Egypt, parts of Mesopotamia, and the Levantine shore. As the West fell apart piece by piece, riven by internal revolt, thralled to the whims of Germanic invaders. By the later 5th century, the East found itself expertly governed by the firm hand of Zeno, head of a sorely needed militaristic infusion from inside the empire, in the form of the Isaurians, fierce mountain people of Anatolia. By 518, after a severe crackdown on corruption and the pursuit of firm defensive policies, Zeno's chosen successor, Anastasius, was able to leave behind a massive treasury overflowing with gold, 23 million solidi. The stage was set for perhaps the most momentous reign of any single Roman emperor. Within just 10 years of coming to power, the domestic achievements of Justinian were remarkable. In 534, a groundbreaking new law code was created, which would permanently alter European society. In 537, the Hagia Sophia, largest Christian building ever constructed, was built in Constantinople, forming the centre of Eastern Roman society for 1,000 years to come. This was an age of incredible architectural achievement, the very pinnacle of Roman development. but it was Justinian's foreign policy that was really remarkable. To the north of the Alps, the Franks, Catholic allies of a Catholic emperor, dominated, exacting tribute from all of the kingdoms around them, enjoying good trade links with the empire and fostering ties even further afield, in Scandinavia, Britain and beyond. Commerce between East and West boomed. Finally, things were looking good. By the 530s, the Eastern Empire was finally strong enough to intervene directly in the Germanic West, wresting back total control of the Mediterranean seaways, ending the piracy of the feared Vandals, scourge of the seas for 100 years, once and for all. On the distant eastern frontier, after 5 years of brutal warfare, an ambitiously titled Eternal Peace had been signed with Sassanid Persia in 532, allowing Justinian to focus on his real target: Africa. Seized by the Vandals close to a century before. Within just 2 years, the Vandalic kingdom was dead, its last rulers killed or sent off to exile on the Persian frontier. After a century of outside occupation, the North African coast, once the breadbasket of the empire, was back in Roman hands. And by 536, led by one of the greatest generals in all of history, Belisarius, the mighty city of Rome itself was retaken. The forces of the Ostrogothic kingdom pushed back behind the fortress walls of Ravenna. Whether the now well-integrated citizens of Rome applauded this victory remains unclear. But a bitterly fought reconquest of the Italian mainland ensued, ultimately leading to the slow death of the Ostrogoths as a people. The fact that the kingdom had been largely peaceful, with Latin speakers and Romans holding positions of power and influence throughout all echelons of society, didn't matter to Justinian. Nor the fact that they'd been Christian for decades and largely left Roman society intact, fostering great works of art and literacy. As far as he was concerned, they were barbarians. If they resisted, all were put to the sword. And that's when things started to go wrong. Though often lauded as the greatest of all emperors, overseer of a remarkable change of fortunes, the change was to be short-lived. And stranger accounts of Justinian exist too. At the very beginning of his reign, Justinian had ordered the massacre of tens of thousands of his own people during the Nika riots, and he never fully shook off the reputation as an oppressor. In the strange, secret history written by court historian Procopius, Justinian roams the halls of his palace at night, ever restless, demonic even, able to detach his head from his body and float around. He was a restless figure for sure. Being in charge of the most powerful state in the world must do that to a person. Then, in 535, writing from the newly conquered metropolis of Carthage, in Procopius's public history, an especially well-respected source at the very heart of the imperial power structure, did we hear of an especially unusual event.
During this year, a most dread portent took place. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed.
The similarly lauded contemporary writer Cassiodorus, author of a now lost multi-part epic on the history of the Goths, speaks of a similar event. And it's not just in the Roman world that we hear of this dimming of the sun. Writing much later, but using his own independent sources, the Venerable Bede talks of solar eclipses in 538 and 540, though of course his dates are slightly off. So too, Michael the Syrian. Today, using modern science, this unusual solar activity can actually be seen in tree ring records. In the 1980s, Mike Bailey, a leading expert on dendrochronology, spotted unusually slow tree growth in Western Europe and Scandinavia between 536 and 545. Leading to many scholars referring to 535 and 536 as the year without sun. In Ireland, a failure of bread was recorded in 538. In Britain, heavy snowfall and distress among men. Its worst weather in a century. Snow even fell in the Euphrates River Valley. Crops failing throughout Italy and southern Iraq. In Arabia, there was famine followed by flood. And remarkably, this seems to have been a global event. In China, a major drought was recorded where yellow dust rained down like snow. And actual snow fell in the following August, ruining the crops. In Japan, the emperor announced that money cannot cure hunger. On the other side of the world, the colossal city of Teotihuacan, greatest the Americas had ever seen, collapsed for unknown reasons. And similar collapses can be seen all over the continent. Ice cores from the Andes tell us that severe aridity descended on the Moche civilization of north coastal Peru. And drought is well documented in North America. All over the world, climatic record suggests that the climate was awful in 535 for 5 years, and then took decades to recover. By 554 in Ireland, things were still notably bad. Similar reports are found all over Eurasia. Today, we know that in the mid-6th century, something did happen. It can be seen in the climatological record as well as the contemporary sources. Given the wealth of evidence, numerous writers have even gone so far to suggest the 6th century to be the single most abrupt climatic occurrence of the last 2 millennia. But what caused the problem? Well, it's unclear. There was no scientific method back then, and no one bore witness to the actual cause of the event. Just the repercussions. A giant asteroid, perhaps? A comet colliding with the Earth? Such a thing has been seen before with the Tunguska event of 1908, which flattened some 80 million Siberian trees over an area well over 2,000 kilometers. Altering the carbon content of the atmosphere in the process. The most likely scenario, however, is one we humans know all too well. In 1816, a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia caused so much material to be pushed upwards into the atmosphere that the effects were felt as far away as Britain. This so-called year without summer is just one recent example of the volcanic power of the Earth. A similarly devastating eruption of Hekla in Iceland in around 1000 BC could have caused a similarly world-changing climatic event. But where was this volcano? We can't be sure, but one candidate is El Chichon in Chiapas, Mexico. Another is the Ring of Fire, the long chain of volcanoes between Samoa and Sumatra in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, homeland of the Polynesians, making tracks out into the wide Pacific. Whatever the cause for it, the scientific evidence suggests a dramatic slowing of tree growth, an apocalyptic image of a mysterious dry fog rolling over the land, sending the world into darkness for a year. Colder temperatures, crop failures, drought. People might have feared whether the sun would ever shine again. And then, just when the Romans might have thought that things were getting back to normal, once the abundant harvests of the previous years had been consumed, in perhaps one of the worst strokes of luck ever seen in history, bubonic plague arrived in Constantinople. An entirely new disease developed from close human interaction with domestic animals, which no one had any immunity to. Ticking time bomb ever since the domestication of animals some 10,000 years before. What followed was by far the worst epidemic the world had ever seen. Not even the Emperor was safe. Seeming to originate at the Egyptian port city of Alexandria, where it had arrived from who knows where, possibly Eurasia or Africa. The disease spread far and wide. Alexandria was one of the greatest port cities in the Eastern Mediterranean, with links all over the known world. And by 542, the plague arrived in the capital. The 6th century church historian Evagrius describes what happened next in grim detail. Great pus-filled buboes developing on orifices, faces swelling, eyes bloody. Those stricken often lost their minds entirely before the end. And even if one recovered, the disease would strike again and again and again. Another eyewitness, John of Ephesus, wrote that homes suddenly became tombs, masters and servants alike dying in droves, with no one left to bury the dead. Their corpses mingled together in their bedrooms. John managed to escape the city, only to find the situation much the same in the countryside. Corpses littering roads, festering in the sun. Cattle roamed aimlessly with no one to tend to them. Fields abundant in grain lay untilled, no one left to reap or gather the crop. Even the emperor himself was stricken, laying low with particularly nasty buboes on his armpits. Though, with the help of the best medical care in the world at the time, he survived. Ordering colossal mass graves to be built, plague ships overloaded with corpses sent again and again to dump the bodies into the Black Sea. All in all, more than 50% of the city's population is thought to have died. And Constantinople had links all over Europe, in the east and now the west, where similar levels of casualties would take place. By 554, the Annals of Ulster record the plague arriving in Britain. Across the world, all in all, around 100 million people are thought to have died. And this was just the first of hundreds of outbreaks to strike Eurasia again and again and again for hundreds of years to come, well into the 8th century. There's a good argument that this is the moment the Roman Empire collapsed for good. And as we shall see, things would only get worse. By 546, given respite to lick their wounds and reform for one last final fight for their very way of life. The Ostrogoths were back in full force. Led by a charismatic new king, Totila, Rome was sacked after a year-long siege, its walls torn down, its people sent away. For after this third sack in 150 years, Totila angrily threatened to now turn the place into grazing land for his sheep, in revenge for the aggressive attack on his people. But Belisarius isn't remembered as one of the greatest generals in history for nothing, and a vicious back and forth war followed for years to come, with Rome changing hands yet again. Within a few decades, yet more Germanic warriors would arrive to smash their way into the peninsula. Still pagan and fiercely warlike, these were the barbarians that Justinian had feared. And yet, the Lombards were lured south by vengeful Eastern Roman diplomacy. If they couldn't have Italy, then the Ostrogoths certainly couldn't either. In Britain too, the advance of the Germanic settlers began anew. Heading westwards along the Thames into the middle borderlands, Viraconium, Cirencester, and other towns too falling into Saxon hands. And particularly in the north, with the foundation and expansion of a new kingdom on the eastern seaboard, carved out by the keels of Anglian warlords. We know it as Bernicia, and we'll be seeing much more of them later. But most dangerous of all, far to the east, over the vast plains to the north of the Black Sea, Avar steppe nomads, horsemen of the apocalypse made flesh, continued their westward march. Tens of thousands of them. Once the undisputed rulers of Inner Asia, now refugees, driving hundreds of thousands of pack animals before them to pastures new. For the droughts of the 530s hadn't just hit agricultural areas, they'd extended far into Central Asia, Mongolia and Siberia too. This vast ocean of grassland, already marginal at the best of times, in many areas became unlivable, setting off a chain of events that would lead the Avar horde all the way to the walls of Constantinople itself. Losers in a conflict on the other side of the world, just as the Huns had done before them, and others would do time and time again over the centuries to come, the horde moved west. Skirting around the north shores of the Caspian Sea, leaving death in their wake. Eventually, they moved onto the fertile grasslands north of the Caucasus, and from there, the Hungarian plain, subduing all they came across, creating a new empire stretching from the Rhine to the Volga. From the Baltic to the Balkans. Driving before them entire nations of Slavic refugees. Permanently altering the patchwork of states that would develop in Eastern Europe. And leading to mass population movements into the frontiers of the helpless Eastern Empire, already massively weakened by losing half of its tax base to the plague. In just a few short decades, the world had changed irrevocably. The Western Empire was dead for good, and the Eastern hung on by the skin of its teeth. Never again able to interfere as far west as it had done under Justinian. Harassed by constant warfare, faced with recurrent plague epidemics, civil strife, dictatorships, the Eastern Empire now very nearly died entirely. By the 570s, the Avar state was one of the largest realms Europe had ever known. When they weren't raiding the empire, the elite Avar horse lords and their Slavic subjects, all resolute pagans, extorted it for cash. Content to exist parasitically from massive peace payments. Year after year, the imperial coffers ran a little smaller. The Avars got a little richer. Still visible today in immensely elaborate burials found all over the Hungarian plain. In the space of just a few decades, from the end of Justinian's reign, the imperial tax base is thought to have shrunk by approximately 60% as a result of Avar and Slavic land grabs. And then, of course, the Persians were back. Justinian's so-called eternal peace, lasting just a few decades. As the Avars beset the west, besieging the great city itself, the Persians took the east. Seizing Mesopotamia, the Levant, even the Christian stronghold of Egypt. And then, in the early 7th century, from the south this time, an entirely new force arrived to sweep away all in its path. For the Muslims had arrived. The mortal enemy of Constantinople for 1,000 years to come. Firmly now on the defensive for 400 years, the East no longer had the luxury of direct involvement in the West. Any post-Roman holdouts there were on their own. Meanwhile, in Britain, long gone were the days when tens of thousands of soldiers marched out of city gates to war. When armadas sailed past the great sea fortresses of the Western Headlands. great construction projects undertaken on the orders of the emperor. Oceans and continents away. All that had been a thing of the past for more than 100 years. And despite the immense leaps forward in our archaeological understanding of this era made in recent decades, most of what happened still remains shrouded in mystery. Just one solitary contemporary source survives. Penned by a Romano-British monk, writing in late Roman Latin vernacular, sometime in the 6th century. Probably before the plague which swept through Europe in the 540s, and likely not earlier than 500. Though scholarly consensus usually places the work towards the end of the middle of the 6th century, say the early 530s. And that source, it's difficult to really understand. It's not a history. There aren't any dates. Rather, it's a fiery sermon, the writings of an incredibly angry man, disgusted by the actions of the warring kings of the island. And of course, the historical section of Gildas is highly unreliable. He wasn't a historian, nor was he particularly concerned with accuracy. And yet, as fate would have it, it remains the only source we have, everything else being lost to time. Much of the text is made up of biblical quotes, and it's not entirely obvious when our writer is being truthful, and when he is simply launching scathing attacks on people he hates. Yet, nonetheless, it does provide an incredible glimpse into this otherwise dark period. And Gildas, he is not happy. The work is called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, and in English, the language of Gildas's enemies, on the ruin and conquest of Britain. Divided into 3 sections, Part 1 provides a brief overview of the events of the previous 100 years or so, since the Romans pulled out of Britain. In fiery language, it speaks of devastation by Pictish and Scottish raiders, Saxons and Anglian pirates ravaging the shorelines of the North Sea.
The barbarians push us back to the sea. The sea pushes us back to the barbarians. Between these two kinds of death, we are either drowned or slaughtered.
So dire was the situation that several appeals for aid were sent to the Imperial Roman Court at Ravenna, to the Emperor Honorius, and later the Magister Militum Aetius Flavius. These appeals are now known as the Groans of the Britons. But the collapsing Western Empire had its own issues, and no help could be sent. Gildas goes on to describe further events.
A number of the wretched survivors were caught in the mountains and butchered wholesale, Others, their spirits broken by hunger, went to surrender to the enemy. They were forced to be slaves forever. Others made for lands beyond the sea.
And many Britons did indeed cross the sea, heading to Brittany in Gaul, where they established new polities, remaining in contact with their island brethren for centuries to come. And according to Gildas, for a time, the ones that stayed in Britain found themselves under the sway of a powerful ruler, a tyrant who, very much in the Roman imperial tradition, sent for military help from the continent. A call soon answered by Germanic mercenaries. The 9th century writer Nennius names this British ruler as Lord Vortigern. Bede names the mercenaries Hengist and Horsa. The rest, as they say, is history. Vortigern's incompetent defence of Britain, the revolt of the Saxons, and finally, by around the year 500, a successful British resistance organised, according to Gildas, by one Ambrosius Aurelianus, descended from Romans. According to much later sources, this is the age of Arthur. By Gildas's day, we're told that there has largely been peace for a generation. By that time, 5 great kings ruled the southern lands from the River Dee to Land's End. Part 2 of Gildas's work consists of a harsh condemnation of them all. As this remains the only contemporary information about these rulers, Gildas is of particular interest to scholars of British history. First, we have Constantine of Damnonia, the Deceitful. Usually thought to have ruled in Cornwall, where many landmarks are still named for him. Next, we have Aurelius Canonus, who we know next to nothing about. Then we have Vortiporius, ruler of Dyfed in southern Wales. Cuneglaesus, probably a sub-king of Gwynedd in northern Wales. And finally, we have Maelgwyn, ruler of Gwynedd, the so-called Dragon of the island, perhaps referring to his stronghold on Anglesey. He receives the most hate of all from Gildas, almost described as a high king over the others. And though the later genealogies of Gwynedd and heroic poetry place Maelgwyn perhaps ruling from his stronghold at Castle de Ganway, a generous patron of the church, the descendant of Cynneitha, an Old North prince of Manor Gododin, who came down to fight off the Irish. Nothing of the sort is stated here, and nothing at all on the other kingdoms in Britain. These sorts of things simply didn't concern Gildas, only the faults of the Western Britons south of Hadrian's Wall. Part 3 is a similar attack on the clergy of the time. Apparently, people still sacrificed to heathen gods, not to mention the personal depravity of their rulers. And that's it. Only one written work during a nearly 200-year period. Many more questions than answers. Who was Gildas, and where was he from? He was clearly an educated man. The sheer fact of his writing makes that so. Living in an almost entirely illiterate age. Yet Gildas still uses terms like governors, watchmen, and bishops. Titles likewise found on inscribed memorial stones from Western Britain. Some conception of Rome surviving, perhaps. But was he aware of how far imperial splendour had fallen? Or did he and his countrymen assume everything was normal? Well, it seems clear that Gildas was not happy with the events of his time, and aware of a vague decline in the fortunes of society. Extremely well read in the writings of the classical world, and possessing a good grasp of Latin vernacular, Gildas, clearly the result of a classical education in an insular school, seems considerably better informed than later writers such as Bede and Nennius. Quite simply, he may well have been one of the few educated men left. Educated at one of the last schools even. For he was the recipient of a traditional Roman-style education somewhere in the west of Britain. St. Patrick would have been put through similar education, though his Latin isn't as good, a product of his education being cruelly cut short by slave traders on the Irish Sea. One recipient we know much more about, however, of about the same era, was Augustine of Hippo. His parents were curiales, local aristocrats. Though, even for them, people of means, it was expensive to put their child through school. At one point, they had to pull him out due to financial difficulties. So Gildas was clearly from a high-status family. One candidate for his upbringing is Cirencester in the Cotswolds, where significant evidence of post-Roman occupation has been found. Though splendid, this was not. A scattering of houses and halls in the centre of the old amphitheatre. A much reduced population who simply didn't have the numbers to defend the perimeter of the town anymore. Just a few decades earlier, in the mid-5th century, intricately decorated mosaics were being laid at Chedworth Villa. Life going on as normal, much as it was in many places on the island. By the 6th century, it's a grim image of what would become of that post-Roman world. Another candidate for Gildas is found on the Shropshire farmland near Wroxeter. The ruins of Viriconium. The third or fourth largest city in Roman Britain. Unusually well preserved because no one built on top of it. The place has allured in archaeologists and artists alike for centuries, from Byron to Mortimer Wheeler to A.E. Houseman. Interested in what it represents for the fleetingness of existence, as much as the ancient ruins themselves. Once, a colossal Roman basilica could be seen here. Huge pillars and roof, one of the largest north of the Alps. By the early 5th century, use of the building eventually stopped. Perhaps it was closed for safety reasons, the locals no longer having the means to repair it. Soon enough, a number of wattle and daub buildings were built within, the place being used for industrial purposes. A workshop, perhaps. The roof was eventually taken down, the shell used once more as a marketplace. Yet, there does seem to have been some continuity here from the Roman era. Though there is no evidence at Wroxeter of the kind of Mediterranean pottery found at other sites in Western Britain, like Tintagel and Cadbury Castle. Was it too far inland? And had society and trade links really broken down that much? The fear of bandits and brigands keeping people more local, perhaps? There are small bits of evidence to suggest the place could have been home to a bishopric. Maybe this was the domain of one of the tyrants chided by Gildas. Certainly a figure who lived here was strong enough to build a more moderately sized, though nonetheless large for the time, timber hall, surrounded by a series of timber buildings. And Gildas wasn't strictly right in his thinking that tyrants were a new thing. Though those of his own time undoubtedly seem to have operated on a much smaller scale. Tyrants had been a common feature of British society for centuries. Even before the Emperor Constantine had himself crowned Caesar at the city of York in 306, held aloft on the shields of his men. 3rd century emperors of Britannia had all been the same. Underneath the propaganda and pomp, military strongmen seizing political and societal control. And in 406, after a colossal horde of Alanic horsemen, Suevic longswords, and Vandal refugees, entire nations on the move, crossed over the frozen Rhine on the last day of the year. The last day the Romans could boast of total control of the situation in Gaul. When a certain British general crossed over the Channel, his own machinations in mind, we get our first hints of the post-Roman system that would ultimately develop in Britain. Constantine III, we're told by the historian Zosimus, adopted the name in respect for the first Christian emperor of 70 years before, was the third tyrant in as many months. The others, one apparently a civilian from a city council, perhaps one of the first independent British rulers in centuries, ended up conveniently dead. Leaving just Constantine to make his grasp for power. Following in the footsteps of the late 4th century general Magnus Maximus, Constantine stripped the province of soldiers and headed to the quickening maelstrom of Gaul. Appointing a Briton and a Frank as his right-hand men, historians have hypothesized Constantine's true identity to be British. Whether he sought to save the empire or break away entirely remains unclear. But he seems to have steered clear of the Germanic invaders. The Emperor Honorius ultimately sending a force under a mercenary, Sarus the Goth, to fight him. He'd end up dead, killed by one of his own lieutenants. By the time another tyrant, Riotimus from Brittany, went to fight in Gaul, taking a large force of many thousands with him, the army opposing him no longer professed any loyalty to Rome. They were the Hearthguard of Yorick, one of the mightiest of all Gothic war leaders. Successor to Alaric, the sacker of Rome, the king of the Visigothic state which now sprawled over much of what was once the imperial provinces of Hispania and Gaul. Riotimus, a candidate for the inspiration for King Arthur, known from contemporary letters as well as a later historian, Jordanus, would be defeated by Yorick. And then, just 3 years later, the Germanic mercenaries who resided over the rump of the empire, now confined entirely to Italy, decided to depose the last emperor. The Western Empire had already lingered on for more than 60 years, dominated by Germanic generals. But now, it was dead. After pulling the strings for many years, the leader of the army, the Germanic general Odoacer, seized total control instead. Where consuls and emperors had once reigned, kingship had now been born. But wait, a letter, you may ask? Well, yes, literacy never died on the continent. And thankfully, there are many continental sources, aside from Gildas, with which we can use to construct a basic narrative of events in Britain during the years 400 to 600. Porchester Castle, Hampshire. It may look like a medieval castle today, but almost all of the fortifications here are much older. Here stands some of the greatest surviving Roman architecture in Western Europe. Just one of a string of fortifications built all around Britain towards the end of the 3rd century to protect the province in increasingly dangerous times. From Brancaster in the north to Porchester in the west. And further north still, signal towers lined the northeastern shore of Northumberland. Great fortresses flanked Britain's western seaboard too, at Carlisle, Lancaster, Cardiff and more, facing the grim Irish Sea, home to increasingly daring pirates. And of course, along the northern frontier, Hadrian's Wall, manned in part even after the empire fell. Yet, even all these defences weren't enough. Many raids are recorded, and no doubt many more remain unrecorded. The most significant comes in 368, when a so-called conspiracy of Picts, Scots, Atticotti and Saxons are recorded by the historian Ammianus Marcellinus. But great Roman war leaders could still be found at this time, and after a year of rampant violence, the revolt was suppressed by a famed general from Spain, the father of a future emperor, Count Theodosius. And yet, the situation wasn't as simple as that. One of the foremost military positions in Britain, the Duke of the Saxon Shore, in 367, may have been a German. Times were changing, and Roman Britain by this time was already a shadow of what it had once been. In recession for hundreds of years, its towns had gradually shrunk in size. Its great buildings gradually dismantled, replaced by gardens and pavilions. Its population standing at around 2 million by the end of the 3rd century. By the middle of the 5th, even long before the plague of Justinian, it had declined by a half. When Constantine headed to the continent in 407, the men he took were a far cry of the well-drilled armies of previous generations. By now, soldiers were largely hereditary, living with their families in static held positions. It was around this time that the very last coins ever produced in Roman Britain would be minted. A situation that rapidly hastened the decline, leading to a barter economy. Currency wouldn't return until the 7th century. And with the economy went the last vestiges of the regular army, no longer being paid salaries. In places like Burd Oswald on Hadrian's Wall, once the Roman fort of Banner, the men had no choice but to fight. Not for pay now, but for their families, their very way of life. It's no wonder that Germanic mercenaries began to be recruited by fearful Romano-Britons. They needed the protection, not only from outsiders, but from their own neighbours. Having been occupied for close to 400 years, many in the lowland southeast had spoken Latin as a first language, not British, and had little in common with their more barbarous northern neighbours. It was these most Romanised and pacified areas that suffered the most. Germanic culture being perceptible in the archaeological record as early as 430 AD. But no doubt newcomers came in too. following distant kinsmen serving in the Roman army. By around 400 AD, events on the continent almost forced this to happen. The losers in power struggles against their Thuringian and Frankish neighbours, the Old Saxons living along the German shore, were similarly beset by shifting, unpredictable shorelines and increasingly deadly climatic conditions. A migrant crisis is very possible. All of which was later neatly collated into the tale of Hengist and Horsa and the insurgents of the mercenaries. But as far as archaeology is concerned, it wasn't all bad. Some areas continued in much the same way they had before. In the 3rd century, the largely self-governed Britannia Prima had proved remarkably resilient. And many might have assumed that life would go on in the 5th century, perhaps hoping for a revival of the empire. Tying in neatly with the concept of late antiquity rather than early medieval. And life did go on in many areas. Viriconium shows little change in the initial post-Roman period, direct links continuing via the western seaways, even after 476. Baths continued to be used until just after 500. In Wales and beyond the wall, long since having been governed by auxiliaries, native chiefs allied to the Roman cause, the collapse wasn't anywhere near as severe. For here, north of the wall, the far reaches of the Roman world, society remained different. Bordered by the warlike Picts, at eternal war with the empire, it had to be. Within the Roman Empire, a firm division existed between civilian and soldier. The latter was a career path, not a way of life. But on the frontier, where life was harder, no such division existed. Everyone was a soldier. So in the 5th century, in the south, mercenaries were necessary, and they weren't just Germans. At Viriconium, the tombstone of a 5th century Irish warrior has been found. Cunarix, roughly translated as Hound King. His is just one of hundreds of inscriptions like it, often written in Latin, as well as an early Irish script, Ogham, found all over the west of Britain. Testament to warrior mercenaries sailing to make their fortunes in Britain. And over time, Irish place names along the western coast suggest widespread settlement too. A similar story to the Germans in the east. Reoccupied hill forts in Gwynedd, like Garn Bodowan on the Flynn Peninsula, hint at a growing unease of the Irish Sea. This is the period St. Patrick was seized as a slave by Irishmen. Several southern Welsh kingdoms, like Dyfed and Brecknock, even trace their lineages back to Irish freebooters. In Gwynedd, however, the situation is different. They trace their lineage to another region where mercenaries weren't necessary. A war leader named Canatha, the Old North. But what of the last Roman outposts in the north? The largest cities, Chester, Lincoln, and York, must surely have seen some continuation, at least in the early 5th century. Possessing their own independent city councils, they were simply too impressive to be abandoned entirely. And on the western edge of Hadrian's Wall, Carlisle is a good candidate for Roman Britain's last city, surviving well into the 7th century. We have confused mentions of historical events too, surviving in much later Welsh poetry. Cole Hen, for example, the old King Cole from nursery rhymes, has been suggested as the last Dux Britannorum of York. Living in the early 400s, Cole sits firmly at the top of a multitude of royal pedigrees of Old North kingdoms. Though the evidence is flimsy, it's at least possible that he declared himself King of Britannia Secunda sometime after 410, establishing some sort of hereditary monarchy. And of course, outside the cities, we have the hill forts. Massive Iron Age fortresses, sometimes reoccupied in the post-Roman period. From Maiden Castle, to Dinas Powys, to Cadbury Castle. 5th century site of archaeologist Leslie Alcock's search for King Arthur. But that's a story for another time. Gildas seems to have been writing after a lengthy period of peace with the Anglo-Saxons. The borders may have been fixed for a while, since the end of the 5th century perhaps. Then, in the later 6th century, the wars begin again in earnest. Interestingly, archaeologically, few items of Anglo-Saxon origin have been found in Western Britain before around 550. But this would soon change. Moving into Gloucester, Cirencester, Bath, Dorset, and in the north, beginning to cross over the Pennines into the western lands. The world they entered up there, though, was a far cry from the one the Romans had left behind. For 150 years is a long time. And what of those lands north of the Wall? The least Romanised portions of Roman Britain. The very edge of the empire. Well, as far as Gildas was concerned, they were semi-barbarians. Early Welsh tradition even hints of a war between the Western and the Northern Britons in the 6th century, with enmity between Maelgwn of Gwynedd and Urien of Regeth. And though it's clearly based on fantastical travellers' tales, he himself never having visited Britain, we do have one contemporary account of the North. For this, we must turn back to the Eastern Empire and the writings of Procopius. In his History of the Wars of Justinian, there is a very brief, somewhat confused mention of a diplomatic mission arriving in Britain. The emperor apparently still laid claim to the island, and we're told tried to offer it to the Ostrogoths in return for Sicily. Looking past the hearsay and myth contained in his writings, Procopius describes the south as very different to the north. Divided by a great land wall, the southerners lived in a civilized, prosperous land inhabited by Britons, Angles, and Frisians. To the north, however, a great, dark forest coated the land, peopled by wandering shades and monsters. A savage landscape, too tainted for proper human occupation. Peopled instead by wild beasts, serpents, and the spirits of the dead. "1,500 years ago, the landscape of Britain looked very different to today. It was wilder back then. Huge forests coating much of the wilderness areas, stalked by wolves, wildcats, and bears. No place for the faint of heart. And to the north of Hadrian's Wall, where woodland still thrives, one of the greatest in all of Britain still stood largely untouched: the Great Caledonian Forest. When considering this overgrown mass of oak and old-growth wilderness, it's easy to see how half a world away in the Eastern Empire, tales of evil spirits and half-men took hold. For there is a good argument that as far as the Christian Romans were concerned, the people up here still did worship devils and demons. The old gods, many having become syncretized with Roman ones long ago, and thus encouraged during earlier times, still holding influence over the forest dwellers. Up here, where Roman rule had only extended briefly, the tribal societies instead acting as clients outside the very extreme limits of the empire, ancient Celtic traditions were still strong. The Celtic pantheon still worshipped. Of course, Christianity had made firm inroads too, and a scattering of publicly Christian tribal kings ruled over the populace. Regional rulers subject to over-kings, often fighting amongst themselves. When Rome fell, most here carried on in much the same lifestyle as they had for millennia, without much concern for the outside world. And during that insular-looking pre-literate time, when most evenings would be spent huddled around hearthfire, storytelling wasn't just a good pastime, it was integral to the way society held itself together. The Britons loved a good story, we know that. A tale of a hero to inspire, of a tyrant to warn, a monster to scare children. And during the long winter nights, with darkness often coming at 3 or 4 p.m. These stories were even more important. The greatest tale tellers of all ultimately became heroes in their own right. For this wasn't just a land without the written word, but a land where stories, reputation was integral to the power of kings. How indeed to hold together a kingdom without them. The best bards of all seem to have been hugely influential figures in their own right, being paid inordinate amounts of riches to promote their patrons. The wiliest regularly passing between royal patrons during their careers, depending on who promised to pay the most. A passing caravan of a bard would have been a sight to behold. Armed retainers, luxuries from across the known world, horses, animals. In a time when most people had nothing, the bardic life was something to aspire towards and to love. They were the celebrities of the day, and in the mid-6th century, the greatest of them all, remembered in future generations as the Lord of all bards, was Taliesin. In the latter 6th century, Taliesin worked at many courts, at least 3 that we know of. He was a PR specialist, a spin doctor for whoever could pay the most out of the 13 or so vying kings of the Old North. His most famous patron of all, however, and the poems that remain most lauded today, was the great king of Regeth, Urien. Initially a straightforward court bard during his own lifetime, Taliesin is also a prime example of the shape-shifting power of oral tradition. By the time his stories were finally written down by the 14th century, he had become a literal shapeshifter and a druidic time traveller, the possessor of occult knowledge and spiritual lore, transformed over the years to suit the political needs and societal agendas of rewriters, from 9th century nationalists to 14th century Arthurian romancers. Such was his popularity and renown by the High Middle Ages that he was used as a floating figure to tie together any and all writings. In an 11th century saint's life, he travels across the sea to Brittany, acting as a sage and prophesying the birth of a saint king. In the Welsh epic, the Mabinogion, he follows a mythical king to war in Ireland. Ultimately, by the 13th century, becoming a supporter of Llewellyn the Great, by which time he'd morphed into the archetype of the charismatic riddling sorcerer. Taliesin is also linked to pre-Christian sorcerers like Gwydion and Merlin. A similarly metamorphosizing figure based on a 6th century bard. As much as he is to Christianity, acting as a bridge between traditional Welsh lore and the more modern ecclesiastical learning of medieval times. Yet, even so, deep down, there is truth in the stories. Fundamental aspects of the tales which remain from as much as 1,000 years before. And his stories aren't alone. Long before these later tales were written down, at the beginning of the 9th century Historia Brittonum, traditionally attributed to the historian Nennius, we're given 5 names of famous poets working during the later 6th century. The writings of all of these figures, and more, still survive today, pored over by armies of scholars over the years. Using literary analysis, much older sections can still be located within the masses of later editions. Today, the 5 ancient books of Wales remain some of the oldest European literature found anywhere, and are integral to any study of the 6th century Old North. Taliesin's book is one, Aneurin's another. But we also have the Black Book of Carmarthen, the Red Book of Hengist, and finally, the Mabinogion, often known as the White Book of Redeth. Bede, greatest historian of his age, who knew just about everything that could be known during the 8th century, barely mentions Regedd, Gododin, Alt-Clut or Elmeth. They only survive through bardic poetry. But does this world exist outside the stories? What tale does the archaeology tell? Brian Hope Taylor always had a certain flair for finding things. He was a born archaeologist. The story goes that in the early 1950s, an artist at the time with no university education, he stared at aerial photographs of a Northumbrian plain. Cutting-edge technology at the time. He pinpointed several buildings he wished to excavate. Within a few years, upon arriving at the place, it didn't take long for his hunch to be proved right. Out in the fields below the imposing mountain of Yevering Bell, a miraculous needle in a haystack, Hope Taylor precisely pinpointed a high-status 6th century Anglian settlement. And not just any either. As decades of further study would show, this was the Anglian settlement. Royal palace, very probably the Ed Gefrin Bede talks of in his history, where King Edwin, the first Christian king of the English, reigned. An immense cattle corral, timber halls, and even an amphitheatre-like structure have been revealed. And on the mountain, overlooking it all, an earlier, massive Iron Age hill fort, occupied throughout Roman times and after. Yevering had already been a high-status capital for hundreds of years by the time the Anglians arrived. A centre of power for the Britons. well into the latter 5th and early 6th century. And it's not alone either. Excavations at Bamborough Castle, the other famous capital of Bernicia, suggested not just earlier British occupation, but a possible Roman settlement too. A lighthouse or a beacon tower perhaps. Unfortunately, most of the evidence is gone. At places like Edinburgh Rock, thought to have been capital of the Gododdin, excavations are difficult. More than 1,000 years of occupation have removed much of the past, as the place was built over again and again by succeeding generations. But in some places that weren't occupied again, hill forts remain. The Cheviot Hills near Yevering are one example, shown in immense earthworks amidst farmland. This was a powerful place during Roman times. And hill forts during the Roman period and after were very common up here. Hundreds of them have been found. The idea we get is of a militarised zone. Unlike the lowland areas which were Romanised and pacified, raids from Picts and Scots remained common up here, and war was the norm. Indeed, in the north and west, indigenous people lived in enclosed settlements, the same as they had before the Romans came. Their lives had changed little during Roman times. One of the most important of all is also found in Lothian, heartland of the Gododdin. At Traprain Law, where not only a substantial reinforcing of the walls took place at the end of the 5th century, but massive hoards of Roman wealth were found in 1919, generally interpreted as protection payments made to client kings in return for manning the northern frontier. Much had changed since the Emperor Septimus Severus marched north at the beginning of the 3rd century to shatter the Maetae and the Caledoni. By the 5th century, the Romans had to rely on client kings. And what of those kings? In most continental provinces of the Romans, like Hispania and Gaul, centuries of elite participation in the Roman world led to a near total breakdown of native culture and language, replaced by Latin in professional and everyday life. In Britain, though the process was encouraged, it was never fully completed. In everyday life, Brythonic remained the language of choice for much of the island. Particularly in the north, an area not widely settled by Romans from elsewhere in the empire, being largely restricted to military garrisons along the wall. From the writings of Roman geographers that we get the names of the British confederacies that held sway along the frontier. Notably, we have the Damnonii, the Novanti, the Selgovae, and the Votadini. In archaeology, the Damnonii and the Votadini in particular have notable continuity from the pre-Roman Iron Age all the way through to the Roman period and beyond. As we've seen from the Horde at Traprain Law, it paid well to work for Rome. And came with it a powerful legitimacy over rival rulers. With the continental troubles of the 5th century, however, no doubt came the disintegration of many of these old tribal loyalties. Some of them at least propped up by Roman power. Though some of the older identities remained intact, such as the Votadini, new powers emerged too. A renegotiation of a more personal loyalty between king and follower. And over time, particularly as the 6th century dawns, alongside British archaeological finds are increasingly seen Pictish, Irish and Anglo-Saxon items. Mercenaries to paymasters of the Old North perhaps, exiled princes making common cause. Both were common in later centuries, but unfortunately, definitive answers remain unclear. And what were those kingdoms really like? Arthurian castles? They were not. Today, pubs all over Britain bear the name of the Green Man. Mysterious fertility symbol found all over Europe and beyond. And there's an argument that the roots of this horned figure are much older, bearing a resemblance to the ancient Celtic deity Carunos. Part of the reason for the Romans' immense success as an empire was their acceptance of religious worship. For 300 years in Britain, they had not only encouraged native cults, but entrenched them in society by merging their own gods with them. And by the time their rule in Britain came to an end, these cults could still be found all over the island. Of course, Christianity came too. St. Ninian supposedly arriving on the frontier in the later 4th century to begin a long tradition of missionary activity, leaving a marked impact for the entire early Middle Ages. But paganism remained too. Far away from the more Romanized continental provinces, and now in the wake of Roman withdrawal, Britain remained a heretical, unorthodox land, mired by Christian heresies, as well as older ones. Altar fires of the earlier faith still shone on windy hills and haunting forest groves. Far from an apocalyptic struggle between Germanic invader and British Old North kingdoms, the picture we get from archaeology and bardic tradition in the first half of the 6th century at least is different. Far more important than the fledgling Anglian kingdoms still clinging to the eastern coast were the other British realms. As far as the bards were concerned, the most important and famous battle of this era was an entirely British affair. Afterward, fought according to the 12th century Annals of Wales in 573. Today, the River Liddell runs directly along the border between England and Scotland. The landscape has changed little in hundreds of years. When Scottish antiquarian William Forbes Skene came here in the 1860s, along the old railway line from the north, now overgrown, abandoned, local farmers told him of an old tradition in the area. A last stand supposedly made by 300 Picts on a nearby hilltop against the Romans. Upon investigating the area, Skene soon found himself walking in the shadow of the medieval age. This is the ancient citadel of Liddell's strength, nestled on a river ford with immense views across the border. The impressive Motte and Bailey we see today is Norman in construction, lair of an 11th century Flemish knight put in place after the Norman conquest. But Skene was convinced, on the basis of place name evidence, the local tradition, and an expert reading of the bardic tradition, that underneath the medieval earthworks lay a fortress of the Old North. Much of which, if it existed, has fallen into the river over the centuries. Skene was convinced that he'd found the lost citadel of Afterward, site of the most famous battle in all the Welsh triads. And furthermore, one in which the original bardic figure of Merlin is said to have taken part. Skene and later writers have even gone so far as to portray the battle, fought by Gwendolen ap Siedo, very possibly against Redek Hael, the king of Alt Clwyd, as a bitter struggle between pagans and Christians. After all, two Roman altars to a god named Huitris or Vitris are located nearby. A lot of speculation, but some evidence too. Today, Skene can be neither proved nor disproved, for Liddell's strength remains entirely unexcavated, its secrets hidden. But more on that in a future video. Within just a few years, by 577, things were beginning to change. For in that year, Taliesin sings of a fierce battle, fought on a Saturday morning on an unnamed river ford, in a wood called Argoad Llafane. We know not the location, but the enemy we do. On that day, Urien and his son Owen fought against a fourfold army of Angles, led by a figure called Firebrand. In one telling of the tale, an Anglian leader, Theodoric, yells forth for hostages. Owen yells back a defiant response, saying all they'll receive is battle. During this buoyant age of boasting and victory, the Angles were driven back, a leader named Ulf killed in the fray. According to Taliesin, for the Angles, death was theirs, burnt are their homes. Urien, the most famous king of all, often called a cattle raider in the British sources, may well have dominated the other British kings into submission, forming a confederacy of sorts, Anglian and British alike. If there ever was a golden age of the Old North, this is it. And it is his story we turn to next. One of the most important sources for the history of the Old North wasn't written down until more than 200 years after the events it records. Usually attributed to the early 9th century Welsh monk Nennius, the Historia Brittonum is thought to be a political document commissioned by the King of Gwynedd, Mervyn Finch. Living in an age of Mercian and West Saxon supremacy, the people of Wales were in dire need of a rallying cry. However, although written for a modern audience, it isn't all propaganda. Its writer is thought to have worked from much older sources, now lost. Alongside the battles of Arthur and the wars of Vortigern and the Saxons, one much talked about event is also mentioned by the bard Taliesin. For towards the end of the 6th century, while the Britons of the south yielded more territory year on year to the ancestors of the West Saxons and the Mercians, a great coalition of North Britons are said to have pushed the Angles all the way back to the sea, in a great reconquest worthy of Ambrosius Aurelianus and the great fortress of Cadbury Castle a century earlier. For 3 days, and a great turning point in the war, we're told forces drawn from most of the northern British kingdoms besieged the Anglians, either at their fortress of Bamborough or the nearby island of Lindisfarne, which also has a prominent fortified hilltop. The assembled kings came from far and wide, from Alt Clwyd, Regev, Elmet, and probably Gododin. Their leader, of course, was Urien, called the Pillar of Britain and King of the Golden North by Taliesin. And amazingly, the written record does somewhat line up with archaeology, with Bamborough remaining one of the few verified Anglo-Saxon settlements from the earlier 6th century, with very few pagan burial grounds in the area too, until later. But how had these outsiders got there in the first place? Well, on a keel probably, as a travelling band of sword warriors. One near contemporary ship is the 23-metre-long proto-longship found at Neidem in Germany in the 19th century. It's an impressive sight, and a glimpse into this long-lost world. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written much later, but working from much older sources, gives a name for the founder of this kingdom: Ida, the Flamebringer, son of Eopa and king of Bernicia for 12 years from 547. But whether he came from the Anglo-Saxon lands further to the south or directly from the continent is anyone's guess. But many historians think an origin in the other older Anglian areas is possible. Perhaps at Deira around York, where according to much later traditions, a mercenary named Samuel is thought to have seized control in the 5th century. These days, rather than a straightforward land grab, the situation is now thought to have been far more nuanced. Germanic soldiers had been operating on the northern frontier since the 1st century AD. From Batavian marines under the first emperors, to Alemannic nobility under Constantine, all alike came here in service to Roman paymasters, thrall to Roman coin. And by the 6th century, their remains are hinted at in the archaeological record by new styles of Germanic metalwork found at burial sites, and over time, the overall culture becomes more and more Germanic. It seems the Anglian mercenaries did their job well, fending off Pictish and other sea-borne raiders. A little too well, in fact. Eventually, perhaps via marriage, coupled with pressure from more incoming colonists, and maybe access to the trade system of the North Sea, after the collapse of the Roman system, they became the paymasters. The locals either joined them, becoming Germanic over time, or became their slaves. As with many Germanic dynasties, in Bernicia, Ida as the founder rings out above all others. And though we can't be sure of the real extent of his power, future kings of Bernicia all claimed descent from him. For Henry of Huntingdon, writing in the 12th century, he was the leader of a group of war bands operating north of the wall between the Tyne and the Tweed in the mid-6th century. And though no helmets have been found from this era and very little archaeological evidence, we can see hints of this warrior culture in the contemporary Swedish helmets at Vendel and Valsiade, and the slightly later helmet at Sutton Hoo. One hint at the power of these people is the Bambara sword, one of the most magnificent pattern-welded swords ever found. Though Bede claims that Ida built the castle at Bambara, there is evidence of earlier British occupation. And despite the importance given to Ida by his later descendants, his rule never extended further than a foothold on the coast. His immediate descendants too would only survive the Britons by the skin of their teeth. But survive they did, and it's likely that in reality, Ida wasn't the only Anglian warlord operating in the region. After his death, his brood of sons, grandsons, and rivals would rise to power one after the other, raiding far and wide. Fierce pagan warriors bred for war. It wouldn't be long before the eastern British lands began to be carved out by the newcomers. And as far as the Britons were concerned, enough was enough. Something had to be done to stop them. Traditionally, the kingdom of Regeth has been associated with the hills and valleys of Cumbria. And yet, bardic references to Urien and his sons range from Loch Lomond all the way to Yorkshire. His strongholds are said to have been located all over the north, suggesting his power may have extended to a large hegemony over other rulers. And yet, many of these places have never been located. Not to mention the fact that they might have been added to the Urien story by later generations. Due to the unreliable nature of the sources, the actual extent of Urien's domain remains ever elusive. Hailed a strong champion in battle by Taliesin, Urien's campaigns ranged far and wide, fighting against the North Welsh in one tradition, attacking Manor in another, a place interpreted variously as Manor Gododin in the north, or even the Isle of Man. Regeth did lie on the Irish Sea after all. Slightly more concrete evidence can be found in the Battle of Rith ol Clwyd, the fort of the Clyde, stronghold of King Redek of Olt Clwyd, his later ally at the siege of Lindisfarne. One of the only one of the kings who fought there whose existence is attested elsewhere in a reliable source of non-Welsh provenance. The 7th century Life of Columba by Adamnan of Iona. Some historians have even interpreted these battles, often described as great cattle raids, as in reality more serious attempts by Regeth to subdue the other British kingdoms into overlordship. Unfortunately, we can't know the truth, but by the later century, sometime around 577, according to one reading of the sources, the combined armies of Urien, Redek of Olt Clwyd, and 3 kings named Gaulach, Gwaloag, perhaps of Elmet, and Morcant, maybe of Gododin, assembled for an assault of Bernicia. But who really was Urien, and can archaeological evidence of his rule be found? Well, his kingdom has long remained a mystery, but there is archaeology in the Old North. Not exactly where historians have often looked, but in the Old North nonetheless. Regeth lacks archaeology. These archaeological sites lack history. Just maybe they are one and the same. "50 miles west of Carlisle, rising up over the Solway Firth, where the River flows down to the sea, a hill fort stands sentinel on the landscape. It's a tiny site, nothing on the vast citadels of the south. And yet, as early as the 1890s, shards of Ewe pottery were found here. indicating extensive trade links with the far-off European mainland. In 1913, metalwork, glass vessels, and yet more pottery originating in Gaul was found. Though the place was then thought to have been occupied in the 8th or 9th centuries. At the time, no hilltop settlements from the early medieval period had been found, still thought of as an entirely dark age. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, a series of astonishing finds at Cadbury Castle, Dinas Powys, and elsewhere changed this perception for good. When the moat of Mark was thoroughly re-excavated in the 1970s by Lloyd Lang and David Longley, it was definitively proven that the place had been fortified in the 6th century, with trade continuing until the mid to later 7th century. A connection to the nearby population centre at Whithorn was also established, the site of an important monastic centre associated with St Ninian. Apparently the two sites being supplied and frequented by the same merchants. Yet the moat of Mark wasn't necessarily a high-status settlement, perhaps being the home of a master craftsman and his family and followers. It's a site reminiscent of the story of Wayland the Smithy and the Welsh story of Culloch and Olwen, which both suggest the activities of smiths and jewellers were richly rewarded and highly regarded. Like bards, perhaps, integral to the power of kings. They often lived and worked somewhere outside of regular society and moved to where the pay would be best. So, a royal capital this was not, but a stronghold of Regeth, maybe. The hunt continued for a stronghold fit for a king. In 2012, another hilltop in Galloway was excavated. Firmly situated in the old territory of the Selgavai, a people who'd fiercely resisted Rome. At 72 metres tall, it's not the most prominent summit in the area, resting on a craggy knoll in Galloway's Borland Hills, further to the west of the Moat of Mark. But it is significantly larger than its neighbour, more akin to the strongholds at Edinburgh and Dumbarton Rock. Today, the landscape is overgrown in scrub and heather, and until recently the place was known for its ramparts, generally thought to be Iron Age in construction, along with an unusual Pictish carving stone. Etched on the exposed bedrock at the entrance to the fort, depicting sea monsters and warriors. Similar carvings have also been found at Edinburgh and the Dalriartan stronghold of Dunad, neither of them Pictish strongholds. Nevertheless, Trustees Hill has often been suggested to be an outlying Pictish fort, built by a victorious warband perhaps. The truth may have been very different. The chronology revealed in 2012 lined up perfectly with the Old North, the place being occupied between 375 and 710. Like most other contemporary forts, there had been habitation here before the Romans, and when they left, once more. There is now a good argument for Trustees Hill being a site of royal inauguration, just maybe for the kings of Regeth. It's a pretty big leap, but just maybe the most famous of all, Urien. After all, an abundance of early medieval material has been found in Galloway, compared to little in Cumbria. The place also has more fertile agricultural land and strategic access to all sides of the Irish Sea. A better region to hold court from, perhaps, with military outposts further afield. Like at the Moat of Mark, smelting slag suggests workshops creating high-status metalwork, though only tiny pieces have survived. Evidence of continental trade has also been found. Whoever ruled this place enjoying trade links as far away as Ireland, the Isle of Man, Merovingian Gaul, and the far-off Mediterranean. And it isn't just Pictish influence that can be seen here, but Germanic too, giving tantalising clues that Regeth may have been more Anglian before the conquest than we realise. Freebooting mercenaries operating here, perhaps. And what did this kingdom look like? Well, it bears little resemblance at all to the Roman or late antique world where Romanitas continued in some form. This was a renegotiated power base for a Celtic people. In the context of recovery and a new order, rather than the continuation of the old. And even further west, we have yet another site, far more mysterious as it's never been excavated, but proposed by many as a hill fort with early medieval habitation. Today, Dunragit sits overgrown, almost entirely forgotten, save the adjacent village, which bears an uncanny resemblance to the kingdoms of the Old North. What happened here? We just don't know. Until it's excavated, it's a mystery. Archaeologists, let's get this place excavated. If you want to learn more about these hill forts, and many more all over Britain, I have a series on my other channel where I go and visit them to have a look for myself. Go check it out here after you finish this video, and don't forget to subscribe. What became of this land? Well, it doesn't look great. By the 7th century, both the Moat of Mark and Trustees Hill were destroyed by fire. The ramparts torn down and demolished. Soon afterwards, the Moat of Mark would be reoccupied, and tellingly, Anglian runic inscriptions have been found etched on bones. Which brings us back to the siege of Lindisfarne. In the written sources, we're told that 5 kings succeeded Ida as rulers of Bernicia. 4 of them his sons, and another called Hussa. Nennius tells us that it was Hussa who ruled at the time of the siege, though it may even be that 2 rival groups now held power, one at Bamborough and the other at Lindisfarne. And so, for 3 days and 3 nights, the British army laid siege to the island. But ultimately, the campaign would end in disaster. We're told Urien was betrayed, murdered by Lovan, an agent of King Morkant. Jealous and wary of his power, or attempting to overthrow the overlordship of Regeth. This betrayal and untimely death has led many scholars to suggest Urien as an integral inspiration for the eventual King Arthur legend. In the years that followed, the situation told of by the poets is of squabbling and war, allowing the Anglians time to not only survive, but regain their strength. Urien's kinsman, Luark, sings of the king's sons being attacked by their father's enemies. Morkant, Gwalawag, and Dunnod the Stout, perhaps reflecting the decline of Regeth in the early 7th century. Urien's son, Owen, also a famed figure in his own right, may have continued the struggle for a time, but was himself killed. The Anglians ever advancing onwards. Though often portrayed as contemporaries living in the same age, Aneurin and Taliesin, in fact, may not have been. Taliesin sings the praises of courtly life and all-powerful battling kings of the mid-6th century. A buoyant, exuberant age. The good times. Aneurin's work, on the other hand, is almost entirely wistful, lamenting the loss of more recent times. Elegies for dead kings, the faded glory of the recent past. Thought to have been sung into existence in the early years of the 7th century. They lament a dying world. And Aneurin's work isn't alone, of course. An anonymous song from the Red Book of Hergest is thought to date from around this time too. In the poem, we're told of a solitary bard wandering the wilderness. Once regaled in the halls of kings, he now goes by the wilder ways. Following old paths through overgrown meadows, over hills and forest gullies. Crows and beasts his only companions. Finally, our fugitive spies a ruined wall in the distance. Flanked by vine-laden masonry, the now collapsed roof of a great hall rises up on his approach. Overgrown with nettles, empty, bereft of its protector, just the same as the countryside around. He is walking in the king's fortress. No one lives there now, home only to pigeons and baying wolves. But the mourning bard has a purpose. He has come here for a reason. He has on his person the head of the great king Urien. Mouth spattered with foaming blood, brought back to the hallowed halls of his ancestors. sent home. The passage has long intrigued scholars, for the bringing home of the head of a slain prince is known to have been a traditional pagan ritual amongst the Celtic peoples. Unfortunately, whether this is a genuine Celtic leftover or a later addition, we can't be sure. But the passage is thought to be old. Another mention by the poet Luarch mentions Urien's decapitation too. And yet, Urien is also called the Lord of Christendom in other sections. But who's to say these heavily Christian epithets aren't later additions? After all, Urien, like King Gwendolen of Afterid, was one of the 3 bull protectors of Britain. And other references in regards to him are made to malevolent, otherworldly birds. Across the sea in Ireland, a land traditionally thought to have been mostly Christian by this point, high kings were still occasionally pagan, with pagan burial practices certainly surviving until the late 7th century. And in 569, a similar written mention of pre-Christian traditions is found too. When King Dermot was slain by Hugh Duff MacSwain at Rathleg, his body was interred in Conry, but his head was sent elsewhere. To Clonviknos, as he requested himself. Indeed, the Picts would hold on to their pagan beliefs for much longer. So why not at least some of the Britons north of Hadrian's Wall? Nevertheless, by the year 600, the British alliance had failed. Urien was dead, and a new order arising. Until the 590s, the northern Britons had largely escaped the calamities experienced by their southern neighbours. Their wars were amongst themselves, managing to hold their own against Picts, Irish and Anglians alike. But soon enough, this would change. Just as the Britons fragmented back into warring states again after the death of Urien, a new warlord arose to lead the usually quarrelsome Angles of the eastern coast. With a fury to match that of Ida the Flamebringer, this new warlord had risen to the top of the pile. One of those rare, seemingly unstoppable figures of history, arising from a dynasty which usually killed its kings every few years. The Twister, they called him. We know him as Ethelfrith, and he was destined to change everything in the space of a single generation. And with a new age comes a new foremost poet. Whereas Taliesin had praised the deeds of the men of the north, singing of their glorious victories in battle, our source for this age is Aneurin. He writes with sadness, for his was the twilight time of Catraeth. Snowdonia is one of the most starkly beautiful landscapes in all of Britain. Yet, it is a place awash with the memory of the past too. In the 9th and 10th centuries, we know bards and wandering poets walked these hills, travelling from hall to hall to tell their tales, derived from the rich tradition of heroic poetry and storytelling, so much a part of Welsh culture. Retelling the tales of the very best of them, of the giants and ancient Celtic kings, but most of all, of the heroes of just a few centuries before. Men like Urien and Arthur. One of the most famous tales of all, however, doesn't sing the deeds of either of these figures. It's a tragic elegy to celebrate a doomed last charge of the men of the North. One final offensive to fight back the invaders once and for all, or die trying. Still celebrated today, we know it as the Gododdin. Today, Edinburgh is one of the great cities of Britain. A sprawling metropolis, world-renowned centre of culture, and gateway to the north. "1,400 years ago, it looked very different. For back then, this was a rural landscape, ruled over by the ancient Britons of old, never conquered by Rome. Underneath the towered walls of the Castle Rock, the remains of thousands of years of continual occupation have been found. And though much smaller than the nearby stronghold at Traprain Law, this is thought to have been at least a capital of the Gododdin. And as time went on and Traprain Law was abandoned by the end of the 5th century, the most important of all. Once a vast, sprawling high kingship, many scholars think the heartlands of Deira and Bernicia, both British names, had once been under Gododdin overlordship. By the year 600 though, all that had come to an end. Yet the kings here still wielded power over their neighbours. For some time around that year, Aneurin sings of a great mustering to the king. Alongside the household warriors of King Mindog, we're told the assembled warriors came from all the lands of the northern British. Gododdin, Olt Clwt, Regedd, Elmet, and from Wales too, Pengwern, Powys, Gwynedd. And we're given stranger names too, that can't be placed geographically. Men from Green Uffin, Pictish warriors from beyond the Forth, and Irishmen too. 300 of them in all young freedmen, aristocrats even, perhaps accompanied by their own war bands and shield bearers. All had come to pledge their loyalty to the king for one last battle against the English. Mintog the Rich feasted the men for over a year. Though he wouldn't lead the attack himself, he seems to have been too old for battle and stayed in his hall. The force was to be led by 3 kings, perhaps his sons, Kinri, Kynan, and Kinrain. Aneurin individualizes 80 of the men, heroes to those gathered around listening to the tale in years to come. Perhaps sometimes figures they'd recognize from other stories, each given an immortalizing description. Like Caradog, who rushed into battle, a wild boar, an armed bull, killer of 3 kings. He fed wolves by his hand. And Owen, who wore a coat of mail over his crimson undershirt, and is also described as wearing multicoloured armour. And Blaine, beautiful he burned in gold and purple, riding his well-fed horses. And Aneurin stresses that these most renowned men of their day rode as a cavalry army, just maybe harking back to tactics from the late Roman world. After all, we know Anglo-Saxon helmets, reserved only for elite soldiers and kings, ultimately derived from those once worn by late Roman soldiers. So why not the Britons too? And so, when the year had passed, the men readied themselves to head south. A last alliance to curb the advance of the Anglians. They rode out to war, to death, to Catreth. The location of the battle? Well, we don't know for certain, but many historians see the town of Catterick as a good bet. Just to the east of Stainmore in North Yorkshire, Catterick had been an important Roman stronghold on the old road to the north. And though no archaeological evidence has of yet been found, the place has often been suggested to be an important royal stronghold for Urien in the later 6th century. Maybe even the location of the earlier elegy from the Red Book of Hengist. Archaeology does suggest that York and the entire surrounding area up to the central hill country had fallen under Anglian sway by the end of the 6th century. Germanic elite ruling over a mostly British population, perhaps. And when Catterick and the surrounding countryside fell in the aftermath of Urien's death, which we know it did, the Anglians would have gained easy access much further afield via the Roman road. If the northern British were to survive, the place had to be retaken. And so the riders charged forth. What happened next, sung in halls in the north and the west for hundreds of years to come, is a classic tale of heroism and sacrifice. said to have been opposed by a wildly exaggerated number of 100,000 warriors. The 300 British war leaders, probably supported by their own subordinates, soon made it to the old Roman ruins. Still an impressive sight after its abandonment just over 100 years earlier. But of course, the Germanic shield wall proved too strong. All the might of the Britons was not enough. Aneurin, who may have actually been present at the battle, composing the tale just a few years later, also claims to have been the only survivor. The 300 warriors, all riding to their doom. Within a generation of the defeat, mentioned as one of the atrocious assassinations of the island of Britain in the Welsh Triads, Gododin and Elmet would come to an end. Regedd would soon follow. And yet, the tale would continue to inspire generation after generation of Britons and Welshmen. From Cadwallon to Rhodri the Great, two kings who both eventually met their ends on the battlefield against Anglo-Saxon foes. But who was the Anglian war leader at Catraeth? Well, we don't know for sure. Geography would suggest a Deiran contingent, still independent from the Bernicians of Bamborough at the time. And yet, Ethelfrith, or at least a sub-ruler under his command, still stands out as the most likely figure. After all, soon enough, he would rule both kingdoms. It's even been suggested that the battle took place slightly earlier, under Ethelfrith's father, Ethelric, or even Theodoric, Urien's arch-enemy. Unfortunately, we simply don't know. Much like British leaders generally didn't concern later English chroniclers, Anglians didn't concern the British. But, thankfully for us, by the beginning of the 7th century, this period finally begins to emerge onto the pages of history. For literacy and record keeping were on the rise. Whoever the Anglian leader was at Catraeth, the damage had been done. The Anglians around York wouldn't be dislodged, not now. Within a few decades, now in firm control of all the lowland areas of the west, that even begin moving from the cattle corrals of the countryside into urban Roman halls. Within just 3 decades, King Edwin would be baptised at York. Though, they would become no less warlike. The Britons were pushed west, over the hills into rougher moorland. Never again would they push the English back, now in control of all the lowland fertile areas. And yet, from the north, yet another power was arising. In the year 574, so says the Irish monk Adamnan, a new king came to power in the Gaelic sea kingdom of Dalriata. striding up the staked ramparts of Dunad, mightiest fortress in the Northlands. Just as his ancestors had done before him, since they crossed over the waves from Ireland in the preceding centuries. He would undergo the traditional rituals of inauguration at the Kingstone. The assembled lords of the islands amassed around him. For Aidan mac Gabrain was a descendant of Niall of the Nine Hostages, semi-legendary progenitor of a slew of royal houses who'd lived sometime in the 4th or 5th centuries. A figure who'd changed the political system in Ireland for good, revolutionising the old power structures by looking outside of the island, not within. Ravaging seashores far and wide, gaining great wealth and power in the process. Perhaps even taking part in the great conspiracy of the barbarians, spoken of in the Roman sources. In those Roman sources, Irishmen were often called cannibals. And despite being Christian now since the days of St. Patrick, some of those pagan ways still clung on. But of course, the succession was not uncontested. The previous king, Conall, had many sons and relatives, all eager for power. Aidan, already nearing 40, would have to pull every favour he could to secure the kingship. As far as Adamnan was concerned, one figure in particular acted as kingmaker at this time. We know him as Columba, and he is the centre of Adamnan's story. Following the death of the previous king, Conall, Columba spent 3 days and nights fasting on the tiny spit of Himber. There, he spoke to angels. And when he returned to Dunad, he'd made up his mind. For by this time, after St. Patrick's great influence on Irish society in the 5th century, divine holy blessing went hand in hand with kingship. One of the first times in post-Roman Europe that this had happened. Aidan wasn't just chosen by his kinsmen and underkings, but by God himself. But this Christianity, left adrift to develop in the wild Atlantic for hundreds of years, was a far cry from the orthodoxy preached in Rome. Now imbued by the Kingstone, made powerful by Christian magic, King Aidan accompanied his kinsman Columba back to Ireland to broker an alliance with the assembled lords of the O'Neill. Yet more distant kinsmen descended from Niall. Then, his southwestern borders secure, almost immediately, Aidan went to war. This is the tale we get from history, not strictly contemporary, but written in the centuries immediately following, by people using sources entirely lost today. And yet, archaeology can be used to corroborate much of the account too. It seems that the Hebrides were indeed populated from Ireland from the 4th or even the 3rd century onwards. Like the rest of the western seaboard of Britain, by roaming warriors and dynasties of kings. Here, the legendary hero Cuchulainn is often linked to events, centre of an epic tale often called Ireland's Iliad. And centuries later, after so many unrecorded events, by the 6th century, a powerful confederacy of kin groups held sway from Antrim to Argyll, Ireland to the Hebrides. Numerous kin groups pledging allegiance to one over-king. By the 6th century, Dunnad had extensive trade links. More storage vessels known as Eware than anywhere else in Britain have been found here, indicating regular trade with the Bordeaux and Loire regions of France, and even the Mediterranean beyond. Loaded up with spices, wine, honey and salt. Interestingly, the pottery and glass found here all comes from overseas. They don't seem to have made their own. It was those sea roads to the south, spanning the entire western seaboard of Europe and eventually penetrating deep into the river systems, that Columba's spiritual descendants would use to journey far and wide in the spreading of their new faith and their desire for knowledge. For in the later 6th century, the monks on Iona were some of the only literate men in a mostly illiterate world. And yet, hints of older traditions come through too. When Columba, exiled from his native Ireland, founded his stronghold on the island of Iona, there are hints of a blood sacrifice made to consecrate the ground. A human sacrifice. Yet Adamnan also writes of 30 monasteries personally founded by Columba, who ranged far and wide in Pict land, converting people, as well as transcribing hundreds of books. And amazingly, it's because of the literacy on Iona, where a now lost chronicle seems to have been maintained throughout this era, that we have a unique document telling us how many men Aidan could muster. The history of the men of Scotland is believed to have been compiled in the 10th century, though it is based on much earlier writings, providing royal genealogies as well as a census. No other document of its kind survives for this era. In the work, we are told that Aidan could muster well over 1,000 men, a huge force for the time. There is even reference of a sea battle fought by sailed currachs, some of the best ships of the era. In other Irish sources, we're told that Aidan fought a sea war in 580 against Orkney's Pictish defenders, and no doubt against other groups of Picts too. But for our story, we must look to the south, back to the Brythonic Welsh sources. As far as the Welsh are concerned, Aidan, the only non-Briton to feature heavily in their tales, is known as the treacherous and the wily, perhaps earning this name after the collapse of an alliance with Redek Hyle, king of Dumbarton Rock. Another triad records Aidan's host as one of the 3 faithful warbands of the island of Britain, as they went to sea for their lord. Maybe reflecting a lost account of an expedition to Man or Orkney, perhaps suggesting a significant British contingent in Aidan's army. Indeed, many Welsh works claim that Aidan had a British mother. A dynastic allegiance between two kingdoms, perhaps. So then, by the start of the 7th century, it's speculation, but there is a chance that Aidan may have grieved when he heard of the slaughter at Catrath. His people shared the same religion as the Britons, and much more of a similar way of life. Either this, or he saw it as an opportunity to carve out his own dominion over the south. For not long afterwards, he called his banners, gathering together a huge army from his kingdoms, as well as significant numbers of O'Neill from Tara across the sea, led by Mael Umay, the brother of the High King of Ireland. As well as contingents of Britons, and maybe even exiled Anglian princes making their own place for power. These are hinted at by archaeology at Dunad. And of course, the enemy that they were fighting was the Twister, Ethelfrith of Bernicia. By the year 603, a reckoning was on the way. Elsewhere in the world, the tyrant Phocas reigned in Byzantium. To the east, the Sasanian Shahs sent forth their armies to do battle, still standing guard over one of the largest border walls the world had ever seen. The latest incarnation of classical Eastern empires to arise in Mesopotamia ever since the Sumerians many thousands of years before. Further east still, the first great Turkish confederation, the Blue Sky Gurk Turks, still Tengriist in their belief system, held sway over nearly the entirety of the Eurasian steppe. In Arabia to the south, polytheism still reigned. For this was an age before Islam was even born. And in remote far-off Britain, the first great battle in British history, just on the edge of verifiable recorded events, would be fought. The two armies met, so we're told, at a pre-arranged place somewhere in the north of Britain called Deg's Stone. A great monolith described by Bede. Apparently, everybody knew where it was, though the location is lost today. The ensuing battle, by far the largest conflict since the fall of Roman Britain, pitted the two foremost superpowers of the north against one another, squabbling over the carcass of the Old North. To the victor would go the lands of the Britons. Aidan's name does not speak favourably to his reputation amongst the Britons of Old Clwt, where some of our sources may have originated with a long-lost chronicle written there. It may be that Degsastan was fought over control of Lothian in the aftermath of Catrath. There are even hints of an Irish raid on Bamborough in the bardic tradition. And no doubt many Britons saw the Irish, Christians at least, as a far preferable choice of overlord to the Anglians. We don't actually know whether Ethelfrith was present at the battle, though it's likely he was. His father had likely been killed by the Britons when he was a boy, and ever since that time, all he'd known was war. And by the time he came of age, he didn't just have one axe to grind. He had thousands of them. Outnumbered as they were, the Anglians were probably better armed and better motivated. They marched in several detachments, led by largely independent war leaders, followed by incredibly loyal followers. Ethelfrith's brother, Theodbald, led one of the Anglian detachments, supported by elite hearth troops, professional career soldiers whose code and very way of life demanded they fight to the death if their lord was killed. No doubt many of them veterans of Catrath, trailed by a swarm of less well-equipped regular farmer soldiers eager for glory. Herring, son of Hussa, the warlord who'd fought against Urien at Lindisfarne a generation earlier, may even have fought on the Irish side, or perhaps opted to watch the fighting and join the winner, as so many precariously allied noblemen would do throughout history. The fighting was brutal, lasting all day. We can imagine the Anglian shield wall shattering the British cavalry charge again and again, though suffering horrendous casualties in the process. According to Adamnan, Aidan's son Domengart was killed in the fray, along with the Irish prince Mael Umay. Yet Theodbald died too. We can imagine his retainers going to their doom around him, devastated at the death of their lord, their sole means of attaining glory and power. Even hundreds of years later, long after Christianity took hold, Anglo-Saxon soldiers still saw it as their God-given duty to either die for their lord or triumph against the enemy that killed him. Tradition dictated they would be cast out from society if they didn't. And this grim determination may be one of the reasons for their success in the battle. Chopping off the head of the snake simply didn't work with this enemy. They would fight harder, and if victorious, another would take the Lord's place. In the aftermath of the battle, not just the Dalriatans and the Britons, but all Christians in Britain suffered a devastating blow. Aidan had been chosen by God, which meant God was on the side of the pagans. It must have been a terrifying existential crisis. Within a year or two, Ethelfrith successfully annexed Deira, unifying the two Anglian kingdoms into one, laying the foundation for the Kingdom of Northumbria, and adding its young warriors to his growing force. For him, the battle was especially beneficial, taking out Anglian rivals as well as the Irish. Bede tells us that not only was almost the entire Dalriatan force wiped out, but never again, even right up until his own time, well over a century later, would the Irish ever dare to attack English lands, thus putting an end to almost 300 years of Irish piracy and raiding on British shores. In the space of a single day, everything had changed. Had the Alliance won, history would have been very different. But they didn't. the Old North was doomed. The choice was now simple: resist and be destroyed, or pay tribute and join Ethelfrith. In the years to come, Ethelfrith's warriors ranged far and wide. As far as the Welsh stories are concerned, brutalising those who opposed them, driving them out, killing or taking slaves of anyone who hadn't already fled. For Bede, although they were still pagan at the time, God was on the Anglian side. Divine justice against the heretical British Church, playing its part in growing the borders of the first great power of the North. And now, with a lack of anyone to oppose it, that swift advance to the west, seen in archaeology as well as history, continued unabated. By 613, in an especially bold move, Ethelfrith advanced all the way to the River Dee in what is now Cheshire, perhaps seeking to drive a wedge between the northern and the western Britons. Dedicated to a Celtic war goddess in days gone by, perhaps still venerated by some, the Dee was a stronghold of British rule. A great walled city of the Romans stood there still, once home to an entire legion. Today, we know the place as Chester. Perhaps allied to the city of Viriconium to the south. Before the Anglian Mercians rose to prominence under their own conquering king, Penda, the region is thought to have been ruled by a prince of Powys, one of the most powerful of the Welsh kingdoms. Sometimes known as Solomon in the Welsh triads, Seliph, son of Cynan, was a feared fighter in his day, known as Serpent in battles. And it wasn't just the men of Powys who came to oppose the Anglian menace that day. Bardic tradition suggests the entire power of North Wales may have come to their aid. Notably, a contingent from Gwynedd. And it wasn't just fighters either. Hundreds of monks from the nearby monastery of Bangor came too, praying for the victory of their countrymen. When Ethelfrith arrived at the battlefield, however, he spotted these priests, working their Christian magic, yet separated from the main force. Ordering his men forwards, they were cut down to a man. As the main Welsh force entered the fray, their morale already low, having witnessed the slaughter of their holy men, they too fell to the Anglian swords. Selip's death is recorded in the Annals Cambriae. Chester became an English city, and Cheshire an English stronghold. Turning what had started as essentially a pirate band operating out of Bamborough just over a decade before, into the most powerful military force in all of Britain. Scores of armies had tried to stop them. They'd all failed. No doubt many more unrecorded battles taking place too. But then, in 616, in one of the great changes of fortune in British history. Ethelfrith, master of the North, triumphant in battle, outstretched himself. Corpses of his enemies splayed on the shields and spears of his followers. He went south, ever searching for the deposed Prince of Deira, Edwin, rival to his power. There, on the southern borderlands of his realm, with only a small force around him, he was ambushed by another king, for Edwin had found a powerful ally. This one with far-reaching trade contacts across Europe. Direct influence stretching from Lindsey to the Isle of Wight. Of course, it was Redwald of East Anglia. Writing hundreds of years later, Henry of Huntingdon describes what happened next. Hemmed in onto the banks of the River Idle, Ethelfrith lurched forward, charging towards Redwald's son, Rayner, cutting him down in his battle fury. Massively outnumbered, with just a few select men, Ethelfrith raged into the East Anglian line, revelling in the slaughter, systematically slicing down man after man. Yet Redwald's numbers were simply too much. He may have even sailed his army up the coast into the Humber to cut the Bernicians off. And it was only a matter of time before Ethelfrith was surrounded, overwhelmed and slain, allegedly on a pile of corpses stacked up around him. Florent of Worcester even implies that it was Redwald himself who dealt the killing blow. Meaning the remote possibility exists the sword found at Sutton Hoo could have taken Ethelfrith's life at the Idle. The famous helmet, the protection he wore. Whether he dealt the killing blow or not, his strategy put an end to the Bernician expansion for a time. The only thing that could kill this Anglian warlord was another. Unlike Redwald, who may have died of old age, probably at least partly a Christian, Ethelfrith joined the ranks of practically every other king of Northumbria in 100 years. Cut down in the prime of his life, resolutely a pagan. He went on to feast in the halls of his ancestors. Unfortunately, no candidate for Ethelfrith's grave has ever been found, and very little evidence of swords or helmets for this period in Northumbria. There is a grave at Yevering that could have originally contained a helmet like that at Sutton Hoo, perhaps worn by Ethelfrith, though it long ago rotted away, like almost every other item from this age. Only 16 years into the 7th century, and the British were effectively out. There was a new order. The Anglo-Saxons definitively in the driver's seat. There was a new king in Northumbria too, this one hailing from the southern kingdom, Edwin. initially under the overlordship of Redwald of East Anglia. Though soon enough, he would pass away, allowing Edwin to go it alone. In 617, the obscure kingdom of Elmet in the Pennines, which survives only in a handful of place names, was invaded. Its king, Ceretic, who may have poisoned Edwin's brother under Ethelfrith's orders, was driven out. What happened to its population? We don't know. Though Edwin later became a Christian, and as such is praised by Bede as a great and just ruler, in reality, Edwin may have been just as warlike as his predecessor. Nevertheless, the Old North had a significant influence on the Anglians. Some Welsh sources even suggest Edwin had been raised or spent time at the court of Gwynedd in North Wales, alongside his future enemy Cadwallon. They also suggest he was baptised by a son or grandson of Urien, suggesting a level of prestige and influence still for the descendants of the great king of Regeth. Though we're also told he was baptised by Paulinus from Rome, as Redwald may have been. It may be he was baptised by both faiths, having slightly differing creeds. By the 620s, Christianity was certainly seeping into the north. Though it didn't make the Anglians any less warlike. Declining in influence over the years to the point of obscurity, it would nevertheless be several decades yet until the strongholds of Regeth and Gododin would fall. Unfortunately, we have scant little knowledge of this. Bede, writing in the 8th century, has almost nothing to say on the matter. His is a tale of Christianity. It simply wouldn't do to dwell on the destruction of Christian kingdoms. But disappear they would. One particularly important event is spoken of in the Irish annals in 638. During the time of Edwin's successor, Oswald, a son of Ethelfrith who rose to power after the death of Edwin at the hands of Cadwallon of Gwynedd and Penda of Mercia, an unlikely alliance between British Christian and Anglian pagan. Oswald had been raised in Dalriata in the wake of his father's downfall, and it was to Irish Christianity that he looked for spiritual guidance. And yet, he was no less warlike than his predecessors, though his Irish right-hand man, Aidan, continued to spread the faith amongst the Anglians. In 638, we're told in the Irish sources that Oswald and his brother Oswy captured the fortress of Den Eden, modern-day Edinburgh. The kingdom of Gododin was no more. By 642, all of Lothian came under their direct control, beginning the long overlordship of what would become large swathes of the Scottish lowlands by the Anglians of Northumbria. Dividing the kingdom between Northumbria, the Britons of Old Clute, and the Scots of Dalriata. In that year, however, it was Oswald's time to die. like almost every other king of this era, meeting his end on the battlefield. This time against Penda of Mercia, fighting again with Welsh support. Leaving a fragmented Northumbria to his brother and right-hand man, Oswy. Regev's end came later still, yet it may have been of a different kind. For Oswy's first wife and mother of one of his heirs, Ulfrith, was a British princess. We're told by the Historia Brittonum, a great-granddaughter of Iorian. Thus, for a brief time, though the kingdom itself was annexed by around 650, a descendant of its greatest king sat on the now Christian throne of Northumbria. A political act which fused the two kingdoms together. An unthinkable arrangement during the previous century. Times were changing, and it's very likely that Britons exercised influence within the kingdom, only becoming gradually more Anglian as time went on. They may even have had an influence on the burgeoning literacy of the kingdom, eventually growing into the likes of Bede. By the 7th century, as we've seen, significant evidence for Northumbrian influence in Galloway and Cumbria can be found. Great crosses erected to signify the power of the new elite, and just maybe an attempt to make the transition easier. By 685, Cumbria and Galloway were securely in Anglian hands. Northumbria, with Edgefrith, son of Oswy, the most powerful king in Britain, even launching raids across the sea to ravage the heartlands of Ireland. Seizing Man and launching campaigns far to the north, taking vast swathes of Pictland. Yet, against all the odds, one Old North kingdom survived. Seated on its impenetrable fortress on the Clyde, near modern-day Glasgow, Old Clwyd, the Kingdom of the Rock. Sometime in the 5th century, a boy was kidnapped by slavers on the Irish Sea. His father had been a decurion, we're told, a title of the late Roman world. Along with his father's servants and everyone else who'd been seized in his community, he entered a life of harsh servitude on the other side of the sea. A life with little hope of escape. Though given a Christian education, in much the same way as Gildas and other wealthy Romano-British families, it was in pagan Ireland, tending sheep on high hillsides, that the young man really came close to God. And after he hatched his daring escape a few years later, rejoining the learned literate world, clinging on in Britain by the skin of its teeth, it was back to Ireland that he'd return. Voluntarily this time. Bringing his faith with him to convert his former captors. Thus begins one of the greatest of all stories of the sub-Roman period, that of St. Patrick. Patrick's story is unique because we know it not just from the saints' lives written about him later, but also from his own words, recorded in middling Latin. Not quite the impressive prose of Gildas, but to be fair to Patrick, his education had been cut painfully short. One of these accounts, the Confession, reads as a short autobiography of his own tale. The other is a letter to a certain king, a ruler of the north who'd been slaving on the Irish Sea, capturing newly converted Christians for sale to pagan buyers. This ruler was probably at least nominally a Christian, otherwise Patrick's threat of excommunication would have been entirely an empty one. Though this ruler did associate with heathen Picts. His name? King Coroticus. Often associated with Ceretic Guletic, a king of Dumbarton Rock. Described as a seafaring kingdom, capable of launching raids all along the Irish coasts, as well as influencing events in Pictland to the north. If Coroticus did rule from Dumbarton Rock, as many scholars suggest, Patrick's letter shines a light on an otherwise entirely dark period. In the 1970s, excavations at the Rock uncovered high-status items from the Iron Age, Roman period and onwards, with continuity well into the 9th century. The grip of Rome never extended this far north, not permanently anyway, and it was from the Celtic Damnonii that the kingdom had its roots. Though the place soon disappears again in history until the very end of the 6th century, when one of the most famous kings of the age appears. Redeg Hyle, known as the Generous in the Welsh sources, seems to have ruled from around 580 to 614, a remarkably long period. A contemporary of Columba and a one-time ally of Urien, who unlike most other figures of this time, ruled for an extensive period, perhaps even surviving to die of old age. As we have already seen, he may have fought at Afterred as well as Degsastan, sending a cavalry detachment under Aidan MacGabrain at the latter. His existence is frequently corroborated by a slew of other sources, Irish, Welsh and Scottish, an unusual amount of historicity. And yet, his kingdom is awash with legends and myths, tales of Arthur and Merlin. For this was the very last of the Old North, where many of these tales may have originated, surviving another 400 years or so after the demise of its neighbours. weathering innumerable successive waves of invasion over its long history, by Rome, Irishmen, Picts and Angles, until finally, in the 9th century, came one they could not withstand. Yet they weren't entirely on the defensive either, not by a long shot. In 642, just as the Anglians pushed ever onwards, the Annals of Ulster report that the Britons of Alt Clwyd, led by Eugene, son of Beli, went to do battle at a place called Strathcarrow. Their enemy this time wasn't the Germanics, but the Irishmen of Dalriata, led by Domhnall Breck, grandson of Aidan. Domhnall was killed, and the Britons took the upper hand. From then onwards, throughout the 8th century, Alt Clwyd may have exercised overlordship over a number of smaller kingdoms, fighting wars for supremacy, particularly over border areas of Pict land. The Pictish king Bruday is even called son of the king of Alt Clwyd in a line of poetry attributed to Adamnan. The Pictish king list names Brudy's father as Beli, often seen as Beli ap Nathan, an especially well-connected ruler in the north, with dynastic ties to Pictland. One of his sons, Bruday III, was destined to be one of the most powerful and influential kings the Picts ever had. It is to Pictland that we must turn to next. By 685, Edgefrith of Northumbria stood unopposed in the north. Overlord of many kingdoms, triumphant in wars across land and sea, his armies pushed ever onwards deep into the north, until finally they were met by a formidable opponent. It wouldn't be the Irish who would throw them back, or the Britons, though both most likely had some small part to play in the battle. It was the Picts, under their king Bruday, himself a cousin of Edgefrith. There, at a place named Dunnectane, somewhere in modern-day Scotland, English power over the north was finally broken. Edgefrith killed. Over the next 150 years or so, his successors, forced to deal with renewed Mercian aggression from the south, as well as Pictish raids from the north, became increasingly hamstrung by a uniquely murderous culture of kin strife, known as the Long Winter. The Kingdom of the Rock had weathered the storm. It would survive, even as the Picts themselves disappeared into memory. There are few mentions of Alt Clwyd over the rest of the 7th century, few historical sources surviving. Though some mentions of battles in Irish sources contain British fighters. Perhaps mercenaries, or exiles scattered by the Anglo-Saxon conquest. Though there is a small chance of them being campaigns directed by the rulers of Alt Clwyd. roaming far and wide as pirate lords once more. After all of its neighbours, Northumbria, Pictland and Dalriata, are known to have sent armies to Ireland at times. In 711, the Annals of Ulster record a battle between Alt-Clwyd and Dalriata at a place named Lorg Eclet, and another in 717 at a rock called Minach. And by 744, the Pictish king Ongus got involved too, launching 3 unsuccessful campaigns against Dumbarton Rock. By 750, Ongus was back in Alt-Clwyd territory, this time fighting alongside Eadbert of Northumbria. Though again he would face defeat at the hands of Tedibur of Alt-Clwyd, whereas Talagan, brother of Ongus, was killed. Tedibur died in 752 though, and it was likely his son Dumnagul who faced a renewed attack by Ongus and Eadbert in 756. Agreeing to submit to the invading army only after a siege of Dumbarton Rock. However, soon enough, Eadbert's army was all but wiped out on its way back south. By 780, though the circumstances remain obscure, Dumbarton Rock was apparently burned. And by 849, the men of Alt-Clwyd, perhaps under King Arthgal, burned the Pictish ecclesiastical centre at Dunblane. By 870, however, an entirely new threat had arrived. After a 4-month siege, Dumbarton Rock was destroyed by a massive Viking army, perhaps under the Sea King Ivar the Boneless, sailing back to their lair of Dublin with a huge prey for Englishmen, Picts and Britons. The ruins smouldering on the horizon. Though Dumbarton Rock was gone, its people survived. Moving further up the estuary, rebranding themselves as Strathclyde and surviving for yet more centuries to come. And as Northumbria similarly fell to Vikings in the south, the men of Strathclyde would move back south to reclaim the ancient lands of Regeth. Place names today in Cumbria still bear testimony to this re-expansion. Brythonic influences revived. Until the kingdom was eventually consumed by Scotland, perhaps by marriage, though retaining its unique culture. The present border of England and Scotland cuts across the kingdoms of the Old North. Today, Old Cumbric still survives in shepherd talk on remote hilltops, descended from the great heroes of old. A testament to the memories of that heroic age and the British rulers who once held sway. Thanks for watching. When it comes to making these things, I'm still a one-man team. So this was a very special project for me. I visited somewhere around 30 locations to film, read somewhere close to 100 books, wrote, narrated, filmed and edited it all myself. It took me around 3 years. So if you enjoyed it, please leave a comment and a like, as this helps promote it in YouTube's algorithm and makes the whole project worthwhile. Don't forget to subscribe too, as I've already made countless videos on this era, on this channel, and over on my other one, Pete Kelly, where I've been travelling all over Britain over the last few years to film at historical sites, including many shown in this video. Thanks again for watching. Let me know what you'd like to see covered in the future in the comments, and I'll see you next time.